The world runs on invisible highways, not roads, not railways, but narrow stretches of water that quietly carry the lifeblood of the global economy. And tonight, one of those arteries, the Strait of Hormuz, has become the center of a high stakes confrontation that could ripple far beyond the region. Because here's the question no one can ignore: what happens when a single choke point just a few miles wide suddenly becomes a flashpoint for conflict between two powerful adversaries? This week, Iran's Revolutionary Guard made a move that has sent shockwaves through global markets and diplomatic circles alike. Two ships were seized, a third was attacked, all within one of the most strategically sensitive waterways on Earth. It wasn't random, it wasn't isolated. It was calculated, and it happened at a moment when tensions were already stretched thin. To understand why this matters, you have to understand the geography and the power of the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow passage connects the Persian Gulf to the open ocean, and through it flows roughly one-fifth of the world's oil supply. That's not just a statistic, that's energy for cities, fuel for industries, and the economic stability of entire nations. So when something happens there, it doesn't stay there. Now, let's break this down. According to initial reports, Iran's forces intercepted and seized two vessels navigating through the strait. A third ship, reportedly linked to Western interests, came under attack. The details are still emerging, but the message was immediate and unmistakable. Control of this waterway is not just a matter of navigation, it's a matter of leverage. And that's where the story deepens. Because this isn't happening in isolation. Behind these actions lies a stalled diplomatic process, a fragile, uncertain attempt at negotiation between Iran and the United States. Talks that were supposed to ease tensions have instead hit a wall, and when diplomacy stalls, history tells us something else tends to fill the vacuum: pressure. What we're seeing now may not just be a military maneuver, it may be a signal, a message sent not through speeches or press conferences, but through action. A way of saying, if negotiations don't move forward, other things will. But here's where it gets more complicated and more concerning. This isn't just about two countries. The Strait of Hormuz is a global artery. Ships passing through it don't just carry oil from one nation to another, they carry economic stability across continents. When that flow is threatened, even slightly, markets react instantly. Oil prices begin to climb. Investors grow cautious. Governments start recalculating. And suddenly, something that happened in a narrow strip of water thousands of miles away begins to affect everyday life: gas prices, shipping costs, inflation. It's a chain reaction, and it moves fast. Now, here's the part that shifts this story from concerning to potentially critical. This incident didn't happen during peak escalation. It happened during a moment that was supposed to be heading toward de-escalation. Talks may have been stalled, but they hadn't collapsed entirely. There was still a window, however small, for diplomacy. And yet, in that fragile moment, this happened. That raises a question that analysts and policymakers are now quietly asking. Was this a breakdown, or was it a strategy? Because if it's a strategy, then it suggests something deeper. It suggests that control over the Strait of Hormuz is being used not just as a defensive measure, but as a negotiating tool, a form of pressure designed to reshape the conversation. And that brings us to the key revelation. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just a location, it's leverage. Every ship that passes through it represents economic movement. Every disruption represents risk. And in a geopolitical environment where direct confrontation carries enormous consequences, controlling that risk becomes a powerful alternative. In other words, this may not be about ships at all. It may be about influence. Now, let's step back and look at the broader picture, because this is where the implications become even more significant. For years, tensions between Iran and the United States have followed a familiar pattern: escalation, negotiation, pause, and then escalation again. It's a cycle, but cycles can evolve. And what we're seeing now may be a shift in how that cycle operates. Instead of large-scale military actions, we're seeing targeted disruptions. Instead of open conflict, we're seeing strategic pressure points. It's more subtle, but in some ways, more unpredictable. And unpredictability is what markets and governments fear most. Because when you can't predict the next move, you can't prepare for it. And when preparation becomes difficult, risk increases. So, what does this mean for the world watching this unfold? It means uncertainty. Energy markets are already reacting. Even the suggestion of instability in the Strait of Hormuz can push oil prices upward. And when oil prices rise, the effects cascade outward: transportation costs, production expenses, consumer prices. It's not immediate for everyone, but it's inevitable. And then there's the political dimension. Allies of the United States are watching closely. So are major energy consumers like China and India. Every nation with a stake in global trade has an interest in keeping that waterway open and stable. But stability, in this case, is no longer guaranteed. And that brings us to the human level of this story, because behind the strategy, behind the geopolitics, there are real people, crews on those ships, families waiting for them, workers whose livelihoods depend on the steady flow of goods and energy. When tensions rise in places like the Strait of Hormuz, the impact isn't abstract, it's real and it's personal. So the question becomes, where does this go from here? Will this incident push both sides back to the negotiating table with renewed urgency, or will it deepen mistrust and widen the gap between them? Because history offers examples of both outcomes. Sometimes, pressure forces compromise, other times, it triggers escalation. And right now, it's not entirely clear which path this situation will take. That uncertainty is what makes this moment so critical, because the next move, whether it's diplomatic or confrontational, will shape not just regional dynamics, but global stability. So here's what to watch. Do we see a response from the United States military, diplomatic, or economic? Do international coalitions step in to secure the waterway? Or do we see a quiet shift back toward negotiations, driven by the realization that escalation carries too high a cost? And perhaps the most important question of all, is this a warning or the beginning of something larger? Because if it's a warning, there's still time to change course. But if it's the beginning, then the world may be entering a new phase of tension, one defined not by open conflict, but by strategic disruption. And that kind of conflict is harder to predict and harder to contain. In the end, the Strait of Hormuz remains what it has always been: a narrow passage with enormous significance. But tonight, it's also something else. It's a signal that the balance between diplomacy and confrontation is shifting, a signal that the stakes are rising, and a signal that what happens next may not stay confined to a distant waterway. Because in a connected world, nothing ever really does.